If I remember correctly, Twitter's CFO, when news of these account purges started happening, tweeted that this wouldn't materially affect user growth. But it has. I mean, user numbers have declined.
At this point, Twitter on a regular basis is deleting a vast number of accounts and the numbers of tens of millions, and only a small fraction of that are part of its user metrics. But as we saw from this quarter, it is in fact impacting the monthly active users. Now, the good news here is that after years of criticism, Jack Dorsey and Twitter are finally prioritizing security and health. But that does come at the expense of some short-term metrics and Wall Street's happiness. There were, however, some bright spots to this earnings results. As second quarter revenue and profit blew past expectations, daily active user growth also continued double-digit growth for the 7th consecutive quarter. However, the question is, we all know that improving safety on the platform is good for the long-term growth, but at what point is that actually going to help growth instead of hampering it? Right.
Daily active users up 11% year over year, but they actually don't release the actual number of daily active users. Ben, what's your take? Are you positive or negative here?
No, we're still pretty cautious on the name. We downgraded it about 2 weeks ago, anticipating some of these problems. And I think the real issue here is there's health, there's the SMS contracts, there's GDPR. But the fact is there are just not a lot of compelling reasons that are currently driving new users to Twitter. That's what we see as the key problem.
The irony is you've got President Trump tweeting multiple times a day. I mean, if anything was going to widen Twitter to a more general audience, wouldn't that be it?
Right, man. It's one of the things I pointed out now for quite some time is you have the world's most recognizable person essentially using this as his main communication tool, and that hasn't driven more usage. That's a real problem. I mean, particularly if you look in the U.S. where users actually seem like they're going down, if you can't have the president, who is a polarizing figure one way or another, if he can't drive more usage, what would? That's what we struggle with. Sort of, you can do all these things to clean up the network. You can do things that we think are actually important to do, and I think it does help the users that are there. But the challenge is, why should someone new come to Twitter? And so far, we haven't seen a lot of compelling reasons, and I don't see that for the foreseeable future.
Selena, you talked to several analysts who actually think this is good over the long term. It will improve Twitter's standing with regulators and improve Twitter's standing with advertisers who actually want to reach high-quality users, not just any users, and certainly not fake users. Tell us about that.
Absolutely. Getting in front of this fake news problem, the bot problem, the fake account problem is very important to tell regulators and show them that they do have this under control and that they don't need stronger regulations that will hamper their revenue in the long term. Now, on the bright side, executives did say that these changes would not affect revenue and that it's only impacting monthly active users at this point. I have spoken to a number of advertisers who are interested in spending more on the platform now that they know that the quality of the users on the other side actually seeing their advertisements are more legitimate and more real. So in that sense, for the long term, this is absolutely a good thing. But we did see user growth very slow in the United States. We saw revenue only uptick 10%, while internationally it grew 44%. So now increasingly, Twitter is relying on international emerging market growth to bolster its advertising revenue.
So Ben, in your view, it's still growing, at least on the revenue side, if internationally. What does Twitter become? I mean, do we just have to think about this as a different kind of stock?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think when the company first went public, everyone sort of positioned it as this big number 3 player behind Google and Facebook, and that it was going to be the number 3 ad platform. And I think what's happening is the company actually is moderating its ambitions quite some. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's probably the right thing for the company. But at only about 335 million MAUs and about less than 70 million in the U.S., it's just not that big relative to Facebook. It's still a very good company. It's still a very large company. But when you're talking about relative to Facebook, which has 2.5 billion MAUs across its platforms, it's relatively small. So I think it can continue to do what it's doing well. I think it can continue to improve its product. I just don't see it getting that much bigger in terms of its total addressable audience.
Selena, talk to us about how Twitter is attempting to reach that broader audience. They've got the Explore tab. They're curating content around breaking news and around things like the World Cup. But it doesn't seem to be working. It may be enjoyable for current Twitter users, but it's not attracting new users.
That's Twitter's ever-ending problem, is how do they make it interesting for people outside of that core base of politicians, journalists like you and me, public figures, investors, and they still haven't quite solved that question. Now, we did see the World Cup draw in an additional $30 million of revenue just in the second quarter, but that hasn't proved whether or not it can actually draw in new users and have a consistent user base. So at this point, I think investors really just need to reset their expectations. This is always going to be a niche platform in comparison to a Facebook, in comparison to a Google, and Twitter's opportunity at this point probably isn't to get 300 some million monthly active users to 600 or a billion, is to try to get those daily active users, those monthly active users that are already daily active users, to become daily active users. So they need to focus on extracting more revenue from the same existing base of users.
And yet, Ben, it's hard to deny that Twitter has a pretty impactful influence on, world conversation. You've got Bob Mueller now looking at the president's tweets for evidence in his special investigation. You've got President Trump wading into this controversy about shadow banning and Republican candidates. Does that add anything to the value of Twitter?
I mean, I think no one will dispute that Twitter is a very important property, but the New York Times is quite important as well, and yet if you look at the valuations on that versus, say, Facebook, obviously there's no comparison. So I think that's part of the challenge here. It's a very useful site. I personally use it every single day, multiple times a day. Many people I know do so as well. The challenge is, can they grow from here in terms of engaging more new people? And there, they've really struggled, and I just don't see an answer to how they're going to do that.